All right, so good morning, everyone. Welcome to the second meeting of the PACTS Complex Project Task Force. So meeting notes from the December meeting are in your packet as attachment A. They're not formal minutes and we don't need to formally approve them, so they're just included for your reference. Last month, we had a list of issues to consider, and we had really good and thoughtful discussion. So this month I framed a lot of the same from informed by that discussion a little differently to help us move from considering to deciding. And so this month we have a document we're calling decision points in attachment B, which starts on page 6 in your packet. And hopefully you've had a chance to read through those. And so, in this list, these various decision points may be intertwined with one another to a certain extent, but we're going to have to start somewhere, so we can start right at the top. And I wish I would have numbered these, but I didn't, so I'll try to explain where we are as we go along. But we'll go ahead and start with the first point. Does anyone have any questions before we jump in? Okay, so, great.
I guess I apologize. I obviously couldn't be there for the first meeting. And my brain is hardwired in such a way that I really struggle when I'm dealing with individual detailed decision points if I don't understand what the end game is going to be or what the big picture is. And so I'm not sure that based on reading the material that I understand what we have collectively decided that this is going to represent once we make all these decisions.
Sure, I'll take a stab at that. So the impetus for forming this task force was essentially the fact that PACTS receives a very small allocation each year. And we need to figure out a way to sort of thoughtfully fund projects without creating difficulties with our financial limitations. And I think it was particularly obvious last year with some more costly projects than we've maybe had in the past, and sort of the construction commitment that PACTS committed to in the future. And so this committee was formed to help guide those decisions in the future.
Yeah. If I could jump in, I understand all that. Right. So what I'm looking for is what is at the end of this, what is it that this set of decisions is going to look like or represent? So, and again, I apologize. I wasn't here and it's unfair for me to do that. But from my perspective, what I see is depending on when a community got something approved and where they were, totally dictates how much they have to pay for it. And there is no equity in this process at all in my eyes, right? And so just to use an example, you have the Portland project that didn't have their PDR done. And so that total as it goes up is not on the community's dime, it's on everybody else's dime. But Benefits project, which had it done, as that cost goes up, similar circumstances, just difference of the time of the PDR. Benefits project went from potentially a couple $100,000 to upwards of $2.5 million that the taxpayers would have to pay. And so from my perspective, those are two examples of the same set of rules that have very different outcomes, that have treat different taxpayers very differently. So for me, whatever we're doing here, we've got to never allow that to happen again. The rules have got to be such that the outcomes and how we apply that apply equally. So that's the kind of stuff I'm asking about. The other thing I'm asking about, or the other concern I have is, I'm very uncomfortable with us continuing to basically ask for new projects and fund projects and put more projects in the line when we got projects that have been approved that there is no reasonable expectation that those things are going to get the money that they need unless local communities come up with them to pay for them. And I don't feel like, based on what I read, that these decision points necessarily deal with what I thought were some of the glaring reasons that this thing even started. And so that's what I meant by what is the overall goal? What is it that, in simple words, what is it that we want to have as an outcome there? And I apologize, I can't help it. When the GPSs came out first, I thought they would be the coolest thing in the world. And then once I realized I got it, and it only showed me the next turn, I hated this stupid thing because it never showed me the big picture of where I was going until I figured out how to be able to show the whole map. And then I love the device. I can't help it. That's how my brain is hardwired in making decisions.
So Jim, just a clarification question. When you're talking about the Biddeford project and the Portland project, are you talking about a Biddeford project that was initially funded prior to the PDR first policy?
I don't know the timings and I don't know the history, but it's really the one that has absolutely put me into a tailspin, which is the Water Hill in Maine signalization project. You know, that project was originally supposed to be a couple $100,000 for us. Based on the current rules, if we had awarded that contract when we opened it, it would have required about $2.2 million of local taxpayers' dollars instead of a couple $100,000 because of the timing and how all that worked. Meanwhile, the $13 million ever-growing Brighton Avenue project that originally was in, as I understand it, in the $3 to $4 million range because they don't have a PDR. That project still continues, and all that, there is not the same treatment as it is what's going on in Biddeford.
Yeah, I think just to briefly touch on that, I think that difference stems from when the Maine DOT put in that PDR first policy. So initially when projects were funded, they were funded for PDR construction all at once. And so, you know, any cap policy applied to the estimate at that time. And so those were generally not as accurate because projects hadn't gone through PDR. The Portland Brighton Avenue project was funded after the PDR first policy. So, you know, the cap on construction funding doesn't apply until after PDR is completed and the construction estimate is theoretically more accurate. But I think some of these decision points are intended to address that very thing because even now, the cap on construction only applies after PDR. And to a certain extent, that's supposed to make it more accurate, but it doesn't do much to prevent cost increases from the time of initial application. As far as big picture, you know, I'm not quite sure I follow exactly what you're looking for, Jim, but I would just say the goal is to update the policies we have to address some of these issues that you raise. You know, I think there's some sense of unfairness, some sense that the projects aren't selected in the best way. And I think this group is intended to figure out how to change the policies to make everyone feel better about how that works. Christian?
Yeah, I think I would just add to that there are there is a bigger picture here, which is that Maine DOT is facing declining funding. The gas tax is getting lower and lower every year. That's going to accelerate with the transition to electric vehicles. So there is going to be less money in the future for these big projects. PACTS has a very limited pool of funding compared to Maine DOT, and frankly, compared to the municipalities collectively. So this is not going to be a silver bullet to solve those huge funding issues that are coming down the pike. But I think that's absolutely something we need to be mindful of. And something that we talked about last time was that actually Maine DOT is actually a significant source of some of these cost overruns with their the sort of add-ons that they insist on and their design standards, which are probably out of date. So I do think that we need to be mindful, you know, in addition to thinking about the PACTS policies, we need to, I think it would be helpful to be proactive and to ask Maine DOT to address some of the issues that they're creating as well.
Thanks, Christian. And I think, you know, hopefully some of those things are addressed in these decision points to the extent that they can be, right? Like you said, like Maine DOT controls a lot more funding than PACTS does. There are, as Chris talked about last month, there are discussions right now between all the MPOs and Maine DOT about how to potentially make things work better. So, our focus is somewhat limited. We can look at PACTS policies, and I think it's good to keep those bigger things in mind. We can't necessarily address all of them, but we can focus on what we can address. Eamon.
Yeah, just a quick one. Can you just remind us of the timeline of this again, and when the policy board might be taking this up, and will these changes be in effect for sort of next year's selection and scoring process?
Yeah, so we tentatively scheduled to be able to finish this in 4 meetings. Hopefully that's true. We have a little extra time in that the board decided not to do a call for projects in 2022. So they would just have to be done in time for the next call for projects. So, when we finish is when the policy board will look at them, and we do have a little time just based on that delay or the canceled call for projects this year. Any other questions? Okay. So recognizing those concerns, we'll still jump into, some of the points that we can consider and can make decisions on. And this first one is something that we talked about last month quite a bit in terms of capping what PACTS will fund or what PACTS can reasonably fund. And so this is about limiting the size of a project in terms of construction cost, or the total amount of multiple projects that PACTS will fund in a year. And so I would say at the last meeting, most people were generally in favor of this idea, considering the small allocation PACTS gets every year. And so we just laid out a couple of options to sort of think about this a little more concretely. Option A looks at setting a limit on the size of a single project's PACTS will fund in a year, whether that's, a municipality only applies for a $3 million project, or a municipality applies for a $10 million project, but only expects 3 from PACTS. Option B is, is only slightly different, just setting a limit on the total amount PACTS will fund in a year. Maybe PACTS is willing to fund $3 million in a year, but doesn't want it all to go to a single project. Then A and B would be different, but they're generally quite similar. So basically, should PACTS set a limit? And if so, what should that limit be? Under option A, I've given a few possibilities of dollar values for that limit. The first bullet there would allow for committing PACTS' entire allocation to a single project. The second bullet is similar, just slightly lower funding. For example, a $3 million project, 25% of that being local match, which would leave about $200,000 for other allocations. Again, this group can throw out other numbers. Those are just to illustrate the possibilities. And then I added an optional addition, which a few people mentioned in the last meeting, to leave open the possibility of using a couple years worth of PACTS allocation to fund a single project that's a regionally significant priority. And so just kind of laying out there what these options are for that point. I'll open it up to the group. Should PACTS limit construction costs that it will commit to in a single cycle?
Who sets that limit of how much money is available for this particular category?
The allocation comes from DOT, and then the amount that's used for complex projects is 60% of the federal portion of that amount from DOT. And that has been set at 60% for quite a while. It was reaffirmed at 60% by the TIP committee, I guess 2 years ago now in 2020.
And the remaining 40% is allocated for the collector paving program at PACTS. That's currently written.
Tom?
Yeah, I think the root of the whole problem is that, excuse me, when the project was, when this complex project idea was floated, it was a good idea. And at that time, everyone knew there was limited funding, which was probably the same 2.4 we get now that we got back in 2017, and it hasn't kept pace with any of the inflation and construction costs. So once a number is fixed through the three-party agreement or PDR or whatever, the communities are all of a sudden behind the 8 ball and at the mercy of the market. And somehow there needs to be mechanisms to not have that happen. Either there's the 2.4 million, you only award 2 every year and you leave 400,000 for a contingency. And only, I mean, way back when, I don't want to sound old, but only one project was submitted. A lot of people submitted projects and only one actually got selected, assumably because of the low 2.4 million, because again, any complex project is always, or not always, but very likely to come in much higher than that. And then as the costs escalate, you're sort of at the mercy of something that we can't control, neither the local communities or PACTS. So I think that we need to somehow make sure that if a project is selected, it has a pot of money that can flow into some additional costs. And maybe we shouldn't select projects for 4 or 5 years till we catch up. I don't know. I assume and understand there was a bunch of projects selected this year because of the infrastructure grant potential. And somehow they got taken out of ranking sequence and inserted based on dollar value, which was not 100% fair in my opinion, but nonetheless, it is what it is. So it stems from way back in some of the policies back then, and somehow we have to allow for a cutoff or some way to cap it, and how whatever that is. People aren't going to be happy, and 2.4 million, even if it's $2 million project, it's not going to buy a whole lot nowadays. We all know that. So guess that's
So Tom, would it be fair to say that you would agree that PACTS should cap what they would fund, but then also that they should leave an amount for a contingency?
as an option? I mean, you never know what the prices come in. Like on our signal project down there, because of the delay and the cost of aluminum, it just skyrocketed. And a contingency might have helped offset that from the local perspective, is what we would have to match. But I mean, once all these projects are in the hopper, we're totally at the mercy of someone else. And that's not 100% fair, I don't believe, without some mechanism to have some additional funding insurance, wherever it comes from. I know it's federal money and there's only a limited amount the DOT gives us, but. All right, I'll be quiet now.
Jim?
Well, I would like to be in a place where one of the things that we suggest is that the policy to only have 60% versus 40% needs to be revisited. And let me share some thoughts around that if I could. In May, I will start my 41st year being involved with Maine local government in different communities across the state, from a very small community to the second largest community in the state. When it comes to asking voters to pay for additional money to be able to pave their roads and take care of their roads, they seldom say no. That's not the answer that you tend to get when you start going out there to talk about major improvements to systems that are complex. Because the sense is that that's other people's issue, right? So if I wanted to come in and put $100 grand in to pave some roads in the community, That would probably be a pretty easy yes, as I'm trying to get to the decision makers who would make that decision. If I try to put 100 grand in to improve the signalization along Route 111, they'd be like, a lot of people would be like, who cares? That's a bunch of commuters and I don't really care. You take it on to the next sort of level. And I understand that the shift was there because people felt like they were getting behind in terms of taking care of the roadway systems within the community, and those roadway systems included things like the connector roads and other pieces, which to some degree people feel like it should be something other than the local municipalities issue. But what we have seen based on the couple of years now is these very really complex projects are not getting taken care of because we don't have enough money. And if we don't end up in a place where we're going to understand how we're going to get more money, then this is going to be an exercise in beating our head against the wall. And so as I take a look at it very pragmatically, having additional money to deal with the overall bigger picture, complicated, difficult projects that need to be done, right? So, and again, I hate to sound very parochial, but a traffic light is needed at that intersection because we've had enough accidents and other things that occurred that the state of Maine has finally said, oh yeah, it's a dangerous intersection. And it's not getting funded, but we're paving a road somewhere over that because of the funding. That's kind of the indirect impact of the 60-40 split. So I'd request that somewhere that we need to have a dialogue about whether or not we need to revisit that, or the PACTS policy process ought to revisit that question.
Thanks, Jim. I'll probably just say that, that since it was just revisited, this group won't look at that specifically, but we can certainly, if this group wants to recommend another revisit of that 60-40 split, we could include that in this group's recommendations.
When Aubrey says it was just looked at, we had a collector paving working group assembled to look at it last fall and into early 2021, I guess. Late 2021. And they ended up being a little split on the issue, but ended up recommending keeping the collector paving program, the funding levels as is. There was some discussion about abolishing the program, converting those funds to complex projects, so we'd have a bigger pot to work with on exactly what you're saying, Jim. These complicated projects that involve, that are multimodal in nature, involving traffic signalization, projects that tend to have higher degrees of uncertainty with respect to cost. So this is something we can document, particularly if others are also supportive of that. So I'm curious about perspectives from others. And I know, Christian, you got your hand up.
Yeah. I agree with Jim. I think, I think much more PACTS funding should go to transformative projects. And I think collector paving should be the responsibility of Maine DOT and municipalities for many of the reasons that Jim outlines. I think the transportation system needs to have some pretty significant changes if it's going to be financially sustainable going forward, if it's going to be environmentally sustainable and meet the governor's climate plan. Maine DOT is not going to do that. And a lot of the municipalities don't have the capacity to make those transformations either. I think the PACTS is really the best resource to make those changes that we really, really need. That said, even if we increase, the split to, got rid of the collector paving program altogether, that would only increase our annual budget by what, 1.5 million. So that money is still not going to go very far for complex projects. So I think we still have to deal with these underlying issues. However, I absolutely think that's something that this group, I would completely be in favor of recommending that to the larger PACTS policy board and the executive board. There's something else I wanted to mention that I think it was Tom said that, you know, we're totally at the mercy of other people because of these cost increases. And I don't think that's true at all. We actually do have control over these cost increases. The municipalities and Maine DOT can absolutely control them and have the ability to change project scope and make these projects more financially realistic by, you know, reducing their costs and reducing their scope if need be. Maybe in some cases we don't need, you know, the Westbrook projects. Maine DOT insisted on this huge new gantry to carry a huge freeway-style highway sign, and that was like added, you know, 6 figures to the project cost. That's the kind of thing that we should be looking at and saying, like, is this really necessary? Because we can control project costs, and that is something we need to do, and we actually have to take some responsibility for that. And if we don't take responsibility for that, we're going to be facing more and more of these problems. You know, again, I'll reiterate, like the age of big highway projects is well behind us. We really have to be thinking more strategically and thinking about how to do more cost-effective projects. You know, I know Biddeford is doing a plan right now about, you know, a new bypass roadway, and like, how's that going to be financed, right? Who's going to pay for that? You know, PACTS is not going to pay for that. I don't think the taxpayers of Biddeford are going to pay for that either. Not just the capital costs, but also the ongoing maintenance costs, operations costs, plowing that new roadway, patching its potholes. It's going to be a huge expense. And like, that's the kind of thing we need to take responsibility for, say, is there a realistic financial plan to pay for a major project like this? Because PACTS will not do that and cannot do that.
Thanks, Christian. And I'll just point out that later on in the agenda, we will talk about sort of the cost control issues that come after PACTS is committed. Before we jump back to these options, hearing that there's some support for this group recommending increasing the amount that goes to complex projects and decreasing the amount that goes to collector paving, could I get a show of hands of, you know, is everyone in favor of that? Is that something we could document right now? Or is it something we need more discussion on? So if you're in favor, and the only one I can't see for sure is Tom. I don't know if you're still at the, I think that was a hand raised for a second there. Oh. Okay, so that is unanimous. So I'm going to officially mark that down that this group recommends increasing the amount that goes to complex projects. Not that we can do that, but that we recommend in the future, near future, looking at making that change. Let's see, I've got two hands up. Let's go to Jeremiah.
I think one of the other challenges here is, I think there's always been this expectation that there's a so-called, I'll call it the conveyor belt process, where you start by requesting funds for a UPWP study, you complete that study, you identify improvements, you request improvements, they get designed, they get built. You know, I don't know what the average amount or cost of improvements is associated with a typical UPWP study, but I can safely tell you that on the Smart Corridor study alone that was done between South Portland and Portland, you know, we're talking, if we include the interchange modifications, in the tens of millions of dollars. So, you know, and I can't even begin to guess what we're going to be talking about with the rapid transit study to Gorham, the $800,000 UPWP study. So, you know, I guess my bigger question is sort of stepping back and going to the beginning of the process. How does that entire process work once you sort of enter into, you know, a federally funded study? Where do we go? If because it is clear, and to everybody's comments, that the amount of funding available isn't going to cover these things. So what should be our expectations, and what should be the expectations, quite frankly, for the UPWP process? Again, I realize I'm dragging some other items into this, but I think we're going to have to figure out a way to right size what we're talking about and what we're seeking, unless it's sort of stated up front in the UPWP process. These items may not be subject to funding by PACTS and may be part of some sort of future discretionary funding application. I'm not quite sure, but there was a time, once upon a time, where those things lived in reasonable synchronization with each other, but that time is probably 25 years ago now. So just throwing that in there.
Thanks, Jeremiah. I think that's a good point, and one to keep in mind is that there's a bit of a pipeline, and we want to make sure expectations are clear as far as what funding may or may not be available. Jim, go ahead.
How is okay, let me back up. Based on what I understand about the decision criteria that has been used on these projects, it does not appear that there's ever a consideration to cost avoidance. Is that a fair conclusion?
As far as when the project is initially selected?
Yes. Right? Because there's some projects that make sense because you're going to avoid other issues that you're going to have. And it doesn't look like that's ever a factor anywhere. And Christian's comment about the work that we're trying to do with additional connector on the westerly side of the turnpike is totally driven by trying to avoid other costs that are way more expensive than the total cost of that, right? All of that movement that we're dealing with, trying to fix, is to avoid having to take care of the intersections along Route 111. Based on what I understand, and having to have acquired property through the federal process, and what you have to pay for ongoing expenses and relocation of businesses and everything else, the next time we have to do something with 5 points on Route 1 and 111, if that isn't a $10 million bill all day, it's not a dime, because you can't do anything without acquiring property. Unless we're going to try to go down the process of, having the fun, entertaining policy discussion about relocating a cemetery.
Yeah, the age of widening roadways is clearly over, Jim.
Right.
None of that's going to happen, right? There's no money for any of this stuff.
Why that project is has a couple $1 million of expense, when you take a look at what it would prevent in terms of expenses, it certainly is a more economic alternative given the other choices. And I don't see
there is a choice of not doing anything, and that costs zero. So I think that's what
I'm not sure that zero is going to be one of those answers given the dynamics, right?
I mean, it's up to you to finance it. So, but PACTS is not going to do it, right? And I think that's the expectation we need to establish, that the age of these big roadway projects is clearly over. It's not in the budget of anyone, for anyone, Maine DOT, PACTS, or local municipalities. And if you really want to do it, then raise taxes on Biddeford taxpayers. But I mean, it's
but I think that, when you think about this, is those projects are going to line up and compete for state and federal money, right? At some point, once you get to a place where those intersections are so bad, and so if we're complaining about what we're getting from PACTS now, I mean, what PACTS is getting for allocation now, if we continue to make decisions that don't keep in mind the other parts of money that go into the transportation system, then we're encouraging.
All those other pots are declining as well, Jim, though. Like, it's not, there's no magic money out there. And we've got to deal with what we have. I think, one of the things we're looking at is, we have a transportation system that's totally, almost exclusively geared towards the most expensive and least efficient form of transportation, which is people driving individual automobiles on wide roadways that are extremely expensive to maintain. And so, PACTS is beginning to rethink that and think about more efficient, cost efficient, and physically efficient forms of transportation. But as long as we're throwing millions of dollars, or thinking about throwing millions of dollars at more roadway widenings, we're never going to get there. So, we do have a responsibility to say, these expensive roadway projects, we're not your sugar daddy anymore to these big highway projects, because they're not very effective at the end of the day. Like, we've built them for half a century, and they haven't worked very well ever. So yeah, but back to the topic at hand.
Yeah, I want us to stay on topic because we're a little outside of our our charter.
So I think the suggestion that that Aubrey has here in the appendix, I think we should set clear expectations about what PACTS can fund, and we should also set clear expectations about how much contingency funding might be available in any given year. And I think we should set a hard budget at like 10% of PACTS annual allocation, for instance, to say like, this much is available for cost overruns. If you go over that, you're on your own. And also that 10% should be allocated on a competitive basis. So if you have one project that's like very high impact and has a small cost overrun, that should be prioritized over a project that has maybe a lower score and a bigger cost overrun, if that makes sense.
So Christian, just to follow up on that, would you propose something like, when we do our call for projects, open it up for those municipal members and partners who have previous projects funded through PACTS, and say something along the lines of 10% of this year's funding will be geared towards those projects that are experiencing overruns? Submit those and we'll compare them all against each other.
Yeah, I think setting a hard ceiling, and ideally that the amount of funding for cost overruns would be zero, right? Because everybody would be on budget, and then we would have more funding available for complex projects in the current year. But yeah, I think we need to set a hard ceiling to the amount of money that we're going to fund for cost overruns, so that the stakeholders, main DOT, engineering firms, everyone has some skin in the game in making sure that those costs are under control.
So I would like to be able to finish the point that I was trying to throw out, that I believe that we should conclude before we get off on whether or not automobiles and planes and trains are different scenarios. And that is, I believe the formula in these decision points should have some ability to recognize cost avoidance, right? Which I would assume, Christian, you'd be able to agree, because if we're doing other forms of transportation that are going to minimize the cursed of automobile, and I use that a little bit with a smile and hopefully in the spirit that which I'm offering that, not as a criticism, but that those projects would score higher if they're cost avoiding other complex automobile fixes down the road. And right now we're just driven these formulas based on the cost factor and not thinking about the rest of the policy issues that ought to be there. So I'd like to figure out a way to include that in this calculation.
Well, I think that is in PACTS scoring already to a certain extent. Like there's complete streets, points for complete streets and things like that. Isn't there, Chris?
There are points for complete streets, yeah. And I would say, right now cost itself, and therefore probably also cost avoidance, isn't explicitly in the scoring. This committee is not going to revisit the scoring itself, but I would say, even as it stands right now, cost is a factor in the final decision making. I think we'd like to make it more explicit what that means, and I think that could include cost avoidance. We're not going to try to change the scoring at this time, but I think there are ways that we could be explicit about what can be considered at the time of decision making.
Can I just ask why it is that we're being pigeonholed into making very specific issues here and not having an opportunity to talk about the larger picture that got us here?
Sure. What larger picture specifically, Jim?
Well, I mean, I just feel like, okay, we have a set of very specific things you want us to make decisions on. We're going to get done, hand it over, and the bigger picture issue is going to be pretty much the same.
The big picture issue, Jim, I think you've identified is the sustainability of our federal funding. And these topics, one by one, seek to address that. And this was the direction from the policy board to this group. So we are operating under that. It doesn't mean that our scoring system is perfect, Jim. And the funding framework as laid out and agreed to by the policy board and required approval from all 7 transit providers. Remember, that was a very lengthy process. Doesn't mean we can't revisit that as well, the scoring of projects. But I think what you're getting at is, just the sustainability of our funding and ensuring that our projects move forward. And obviously it's a big region with 18 municipalities. So it's obviously very challenging, especially with, when you're talking a couple $1 million per year.
Go ahead, Eamon.
All right. Yeah, just to return to the structure of the decision points, because I think we're spending a lot of time on the cost overruns after a commitment has been made. I think some of the point of these decision points is to reduce that uncertainty that we will have large cost overruns in the construction phase by making some changes to the upfront scoring and allocation and work that municipalities do ahead of time. So I would make a suggestion that maybe these decision points are a little bit out of order. There's a lot of decision points that are related to what can be done in advance to better understand construction costs, better understand what PACTS commitment is. Those are sort of further down the list, but I would suggest that we move those forward and make decisions on those first, because I think the idea is if we're successful in those places, we're going to have fewer situations where we have huge surprises once construction is already underway with huge increases. So maybe if we tackle those, pre-PDR and PDR questions first, then tackle the cost overruns, during construction, that might help us think about this in a more linear way. I don't know if that makes sense to folks.
I think that's fine. We're not tied to the order of the decision points. It's just they are intertwined, so it's not necessarily obvious which way to think about them. But I'm fine considering them out of order. Jessa, do you want to chime in first?
Yeah, I just had a couple of thoughts on costs in general. I don't know if is now an appropriate time to just say them.
Yeah.
There. First of all, I agree sort of Aubrey in general with your point, how we address cost in the final decision making is important overall. I also agree with Jim that when considering cost avoidance should be a factor in addressing that. It's not just the upfront cost. If you build a $10 million bike ped bridge, for example, that reduces traffic on major routes and automobile traffic, and therefore the cost of avoiding upgrades there should be a factor. And I think that is a very I agree with Jim that that's usually not how the math is done on that. It's like a one-off. So I think that's very important to making our whole network more sustainable and keeping costs down in general. I also wanted to just briefly hit on cost overruns, and I think we had the same conversation at the last meeting, but I'll reiterate what I said before, which is I see there being 2 different types of cost overruns. One is scope creep, and the other one is inflation, and they're very different in my mind. It's if you're adding things to the scope, that's one thing. But if the cost of labor and building materials is going through the roof, it's that is much harder to avoid. There's one cost where it's you're adding more to the project. There's other where you're actually asking to do the same or less and it's costing more. So I think any discussion of funding overruns should be sensitive to that.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, Jessa, and those are touched on in one of the points later. Amy, is there one that would be helpful to you to start with? Is there one that looking at the list would be the best one for you to focus on first?
I mean, I think there's a couple that sort of go together from that. If we're thinking about the process from start to finish, you know, incentives for municipalities to control costs, in a shared understanding of the project before applying to PACTS, and then there was one other, I think. Oh, and then the question around municipalities funding their own PDRs or a portion of their PDRs, a larger portion. Those ones seem to me to be sort of the front-loaded ones, and then, you know, after that, it becomes, are we limiting the size of construction cost? And then finally, you know, what is the contingency that folks are comfortable with, and how is that contingency structured?
Sure. Okay. So, you know, thinking about this in the order of which, in which things happen, why don't we try jumping to the fifth point, which is starts at the very bottom of page 7, you know, having a shared understanding before applying for funding. So just for a little background on this one, you know, staff, GPCOG staff, and also the TIP committee that put together the funding framework heard from municipalities that the application process is difficult and tried to simplify it. Whether or not they were successful is hard to say, but it was certainly a goal to simplify it. These options would further complicate the application process, but would perhaps lessen complications down the road. So some of the options that came up at the last meeting that I laid out here, an option A would require a 3-party discussion, 3 parties being the municipality, PACTS, and Maine DOT, of design standards, which is something we talked about a fair amount last month, before applying. Obviously, this would take, you know, time to meet and to reach an agreement before submitting an application, but would limit those questions arising later in the process. Option B would require a 3-party discussion and agreement on the project's readiness for PDR or for construction, depending on how the project is applying. Before applying, that came up this last year when there was some disagreement about which projects needed more scoping before they could start PDR. And then option C, we also talked about last month, is the potential to require the municipality to achieve 25% design before applying. So, Amy, and I see you have your hand up. Wait, go ahead.
Yeah, just a quick question. When you list these as separate options, you're not viewing them as mutually exclusive, are you? Okay, just
No.
wanted to clarify. Yeah.
Thank you for that clarification. Yeah. Actually, I think most of the options in the list are and or. They can be combined. They're not mutually exclusive. Okay. So does anyone have thoughts on any of these? I'd be particularly interested to hear from municipalities on how this might affect the application process. Go ahead, Jeremiah.
I mean, I think we're certainly, or Portland would be open to adjustments here. You know, one of the question just continues to be, you know, what is it you're actually asking for when you're going in for funding, and any opportunities to really define that better going into the process makes a lot of sense. You know, it obviously adds some additional work and possibly more cost to the municipality, but, you know, quite frankly, unless we've gotten to a certain level of detail, these projects could be borderline speculative, quite honestly. So I think that there's got to be a requirement to have just more information up front before the real hard ask is being made.
And Jeremiah, I think that point is well taken. Looking at those 3 options specifically, and again, it's not necessarily an exhaustive list. Those are sort of 3 ideas to get more information before applying. Are there thoughts you have about those specific options? I think, you know, for example, 25% design is a bit more of an ask than discussions between the three parties.
Yeah, I mean, I think 25% design is a reasonable request. I mean, at that point, you more or less have figured out how this thing looks on the face of the earth, where it fits into the face of the earth, and are there showstoppers or just things that, you know, certainly one thing I've learned over the years is you may have a concept plan that's sort of just an enhanced, pretty graphic, but until you start putting some hard lines down, you might be setting yourself up for some real issues. So, you know, at 25%, I think there's enough detail to at least start knowing what everybody's getting into. And again, I think then it just begs the question of, once you've achieved that point and you're moving into more funding requests, you know, what is your ability to request funds? But at least we'd have sufficient data to make a reasonably educated decision.
Thanks, Jeremiah. Jim, go ahead.
So because I'm not in the weeds, I'm going to throw out a concept that may get to a conclusion. It would seem to me that a possible solution for all this would be that these complex projects would be done in two steps. One is where there's a certain amount of funds that are not the federal money that's kicked in, and the communities or the sponsoring communities have to put in a pretty significant amount in order to have the concept brought to some level of engineering. And the reason you don't want federal funds in there is that in the event that that project doesn't move forward through the next phase, then you don't have to, you know, stuck with all that stuff. And then all those projects, once they have gone.
But Tom, you're saying that you in Portland and some of the larger communities have the ability to do 25% design, and it may be tougher for other smaller communities.
Well, I don't want to speak for Portland, but I think we can, and it depends on what the expectation of 25% design is. My estimation is a preliminary design, so that you know that the horizontal layout, you know what you might have to acquire for properties, how that goes into the costing formula. And so I think we do that. 25% is not an awful lot. It's basically a detailed conceptual plan that says it will work, or we believe it'll work, and then it moves forward from there through the PDR, but which is a more formal process. So I guess the answer is yes, from benefit standpoint.
But yes, you're in favor of 25% design in advance.
And it would also, if a project selected, is there an opportunity to have that reimbursed? And I know you'd have to set a limit on it, or whether it's just an upfront cost that every community ought to be doing in order to jump into the mix. I'm not sure. You know, I don't know if Joe in Saco has the ability to do that level of stuff. Well, I know there's only one over there, just Joe, and whether Jester and Joe together could come up with something, or whether they would have to sub it out. And then when you start subbing it out, 25% all of a sudden goes triple the price tag, if you will.
Right. Certainly the possibility of having that reimbursed is not something I've thought about before, but I'm going to make a note of that. I'm just going to do a little time check. We don't have much time left. Christian and Jeremiah have your hands raised right now, so I'm going to go to you, Christian.
Yeah, I just would note that Wyndham offered to finance their PDR for a sidewalk project this year, right? So, I mean, I don't think it's necessarily going to be a financial barrier even to smaller communities in the PACTS region. And I think that example is a good demonstration of that. When I do want to go back to what I suggested with the sort of financial plan. You know, I agree that there is a very rough sort of assessment of what it might cost and funding sources at the 25% design. But I think that's also the greatest opportunity to control costs and control the scope of a project. I'm especially mindful of, you know, I can't remember if it got PACTS funding, but the 25% design of the Franklin Street project in Portland, which I think was done by Goral Palmer, wasn't done in any consultation with abutting landowners. And that's really a project that could potentially and should be financed with new development and the sale of public right-of-way for new housing development in that corridor. But the projects, the 25% design we got from Goral Palmer kind of makes that impossible. It wasn't designed with any consideration of development opportunities. And for that reason, that 25% design, frankly, isn't going anywhere. It's probably not going to be built. And we kind of have to go back to scratch to get a 25% design that's actually going to be feasible. So when I'm talking about like considering financial plans and redevelopment opportunities, which I think we should be, that's kind of what I have in mind. And the experience of that Franklin Street project was kind of a good example of what not to do.
Okay, thanks, Christian. Eamon or Jeremiah?
So anyway, just a couple things. One, yeah, I think I just want to reiterate. I think there should be skin in the game on design. It's a small portion of the relative cost related to construction. So, you know, have at that. Regarding Franklin, yeah, it got real expensive and it crashed and burned under its own weight, and I lived it. And more to come on that is all I can say. More to come.
Okay, so hearing a few different points on the financial plan aspect, and Harold's suggestion that maybe we can meet in the middle. You know, how does everyone feel about sort of requiring a very basic, and maybe we would need to define basic thoughts on funding sources? I think actually that's in the application right now as maybe even an optional question, but thoughts on that as a theoretically simple addition to the application. This is probably primarily for the municipalities. All right, well, we haven't made any decisions on anything quite yet, so we don't have to make a decision on that one. You know, with 10 minutes to go ahead, Jessica.
Sorry, Aubrey. I guess all I would say is I still, I broke up, I lost my connection for a second, but I still kind of feel like it's a solution to a problem that it doesn't exist. I don't really see the need.
All right. So we're not going to try to tackle that one just yet. We won't throw it out either. So with 10 minutes left, you know, I think as staff, we're open to, you know, any other suggestions of how to reach decisions. I think one thing we've talked about that I may do before the next meeting is set out a survey with some of these questions to see, you know, where people stand on some of these possibilities. This list of options isn't meant to be sort of the list of decisions we have to make. It's sort of, you know, what are some of the decisions we could make in order to reach the goal of making sure the program is financially sustainable. So, you know, you could always add in other questions or that sort of thing.
Is there any value to breaking this thing up? Is there any practicality to it? I mean, if it isn't, then tell me and I'll try to put my brain in a different place.
You mean breaking it up into the decision points?
Yeah, well, no, the two different places. I mean, you got to go to step one before you can go to step two.
Oh, you mean the funding, like fund design and then fund the rest of the project,
Right.
right? Yeah, I guess I'm maybe not seeing exactly what the difference is between that suggestion and funding 25%, having municipalities fund 25% design, unless you're suggesting that that initial 25% or whatever that number may be is has funding from PACTS. Am I misunderstanding that?
Well, I mean, what I'm trying to do is get to the point where you have a better idea. So let me back up. So the proposal that's on the table is that the community would have to pay 100% of whatever that cost is up front before we can even submit. Okay. And so 25% would be approximately, let's just let me just walk through it for a second. So if you, engineering is usually in the 15% cost of the overall project. That's a reasonable number as I understand it, right? Somebody help me with that.
I'll defer to the engineers on that one. Oh, I hear Tom's muted, but it looks like he's talking.
Yeah, that's a reasonable number.
In order to get to 25% PER, how much of the overall engineering cost would you think you have to be in on that? Is that going to be about a 50% cost of the engineering? Is it 25% of the cost of engineering? Is it, what do you think a reasonable number on that, Tom, would be?
I don't know, to get to that level would probably somewhere around 50%, I think. Get some recognition.
Right. So that proposal, and I'm just going to take the Saco Biddeford pedestrian bridge piece, would require 15% of, the 5 million, which is the cheap end of that project, is 750,000. Each of those communities would had to have commit somewhere in the vicinity of $175,000 each to even begin to find out whether or not that project made sense to do anything in order to even get in the door. That's what the implications of that 25% piece is. If you're at 50%, that number is probably going to be closer for each of those communities, upwards in the $300,000 range. And I'm thinking out loud, folks. I'm just trying to understand what that looks like.
Right. Without checking the numbers, my understanding is it would be 50% of 15% of the total cost is roughly what it would take to get to 25% design. So yeah, it's not $0.
That just seems like that for something of that project. It would seem like those kind of projects may never ever actually get considered under that proposal. And if we're really looking at trying to encourage communities to work together and communities to think, to get to alternatives that don't exist in the existing blocks, I'm a little nervous that proposal would eliminate communities trying to innovate to try to find out the solutions for transportation. So I'm not sure. What I was looking at was there'd be a certain amount of money that would be available so that half of that number would end up being endorsed through PACTS. So you have some sense that the project has some legs out the door, and that will make it easier for the communities to do that. But there's a second check-in before anybody's on the hook for repaying federal money And there's also a second check-in to make sure that the project still is reasonable and the costs are all set before it actually got funded.
Right, so I'm going to see if I can repeat back to you what I think I'm hearing, just to make sure I've got it. Your point is that, communities funding 25% design on their own could be a barrier to some good projects. And then if
I think specifically, Elizabeth, as I'm thinking about the innovation kind of stuff, the things that we really want people to do,
okay,
right? Because it's going to compete against traditional projects, and the decision makers that are in the room that are figuring out whether or not the dollars are going to get there or not are always going to have pressure from the constituents to fix their roads, fix their sidewalks, fix their whatever. And so and again, because I was an elected official and I think through my process that way, you have to keep in mind who the decision makers are. And so if a decision maker has to say, I'm not going to put 150,000 into fixing a road or a project that my constituents want me to do, because I want to put it into this other project that I believe in the long run is going to be a better solution. That's a really tough place to put elected officials in on those innovation. 150,000 or whatever the dollars are for a transportation project that everybody else thinks is going to get done is an easier sell. Sorry.
and then so your proposal would be that some of that 25% design would be funded ideally through PACTS, but not with federal dollars. Okay, so I think we'd have to come back to, if that's a possibility. With 2 minutes left, I'm going to jump to Jessa.
Sure. I guess I like the idea of the municipalities paying more upfront, just particularly to avoid the concept of having to pay money back. So I like the 25% with the municipalities, or of course, if PACTS has other money that we could use, that seems better. But I think having some assurance or some preliminary scoring or something to give us a little more confidence before putting in that money up front would be very helpful to help move the project along. And also I would also advocate for it to not be like necessarily increase the out-of-pocket total expense for the municipalities, but just to sort of shift that expense towards the beginning. Like maybe have there be less of a match later on, to kind of think about it that way.
Okay, interesting. Eamon, before we jump to you, since it's 12:29 and we do have one member of the public, I just want to give him a chance to speak if he'd like before the official end of the meeting as it's posted. Ken Capron, is there anything you'd like to add to the discussion? Is it, I think I'm giving you the option to talk now if you'd like.
Yeah, hi, thank you. As I sit here listening to money issues, there may be more grant money than you folks are aware of, and I'm not sure how to resolve that. But the grant writer I'm working with seems to have access to a lot more money than others. The other proposition I want to raise, and you know what my forte is, I'm working on a project called Microrail, which is a guided system, elevated guided system, not rail really, it's more of a guideway. But the projection for that, based on the market study we just had done, is that within 4 to 5 years, we'll be making about $1 billion a year on transportation issues and other resources. And that's assuming a carbon exchange gets put in place. And there might be some advantage to paying for adoption of the concept in your town, and that maybe we could help fund some of the transportation needs at the surface level, while we get support for the elevated level. So I throw that out there because that's something I'm thinking of. We need to, when we get this launched next, probably 1.5 years from now, we want people to adopt it and adopt it quickly because of the climate impact is twofold. One is we'll have solar panels along the guideway. It's miles of solar panels. And second is the savings from transportation emissions and what have you. We'll be using maglev, which uses almost no energy. It doesn't require fueling and you don't have to worry about running out of gas. So I'll end it there just because it's short on time, but I think there's an opportunity if you should choose to benefit from microrail down the road. Thank you.
Thanks, Ken. Okay, Eamon, I'll go to you.
I'll be really quick. I do have to run here in a second. I did just want to say again that I think I really do fully support the 25% municipalities funding that in the entirety. I think one place that we might revisit to sort of find a compromise here, we did touch on earlier potential reimbursement for some of those funds if the project is successful. I know that's not the same thing as funding 50% of it up front for all applications, but if there was that possibility that up to 50% of that 25% design could be reimbursed should the project move forward, that might be a little bit more palatable. The only other thing I'll touch on is we did talk about cost avoidance earlier, and I think the whole reason that we're talking about this 25% design from the municipalities up front is for cost avoidance, and it's a little different than the conversation earlier. But if we can identify huge cost increases in that time frame, I think we are saving PACTS and municipalities a lot down the road from projects that might have huge surprises that we wouldn't know about in the current format in which projects are scored and allocated funding. So I think that's an important piece to include when we're thinking about why are we potentially asking municipalities to fund that piece up front. So I throw those out there. I do have to run, but hopefully at the next meeting, it seems like we made a lot of progress on this decision point at least, so maybe we can make some decisions at the next meeting.
Thanks, Eamon. And, if I thought we were going to solve everything in the next 2 minutes, I might keep us going, but I don't think we're quite there yet. So I do want to respect the time that was set for this meeting. So, again, I'll write up notes from this meeting. I'll send them out with the next packet, and I may send out some sort of survey just to get sort of our decision-making brain starting to get going for the next meeting. Think about how we stand on various issues. Christian, do you want to say one more thing before we go?
Yeah, I just want to thank you guys for putting together these suggestions in attachment B. And I was just looking through them. I think they're all good ideas. I would favor any of them. I know there are lots of details to nail down, but I think this is a very good start. From my perspective, I think all these ideas are good ones that I would absolutely support and recommend. So thank you for that.
Thanks, Christian. All right, with that, I will let everyone get on with your days, and just watch for any emails in case we do send out a survey. Otherwise, the next packet. All right, thanks everyone.
Great. Thank you all.
Thank you. Have a good morning.